Welcoming everyone to the Communities for Future online summit, where we explore our response to the climate emergency. And here we are today welcoming Martin Frick. Thank you so much for being with us. Martin Frick is the Senior Director of Policy and Program Coordination at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in this role oversees the substantive programs for the implementation of the Paris Climate Agreement. He previously served as Director for Climate Change at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. From 2007 to 2010, Dr. Frick was responsible as Program Director of Kofi Annan's Global Humanitarian Forum for the forum's groundbreaking work on climate justice. He was the German representative for human rights and humanitarian affairs at the UN General Assembly. So you can immediately understand that we are very delighted to have you with us today and hear directly from you about some of the work that has been done since the signing of the Paris Agreement. Thank you for spending your time with us.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being with us. And I would love to start with your understanding of climate justice and how this is also shaping your work.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a pet topic for me, and it's actually the reason why I even went into climate change work, because as you said in your introduction, I was a human rights expert before. And when the Human Rights Council in Geneva was built in 2007, the Maldives introduced the first resolution on human rights and climate change. And that was new territory for me, because if you think back 2007, the little ice bear on a piece of melting ice was the iconic picture about climate change. And the perception was, A, this is a future problem, and B, this is an environmental problem. But the Maldives really started to make clear that this is actually a human problem. And working with Kofi Annan, we focused first on what we call the human face of climate change, working with photographers, working with young people as climate witnesses, to really bring to the world that new narrative that climate change is already here and that it's affecting people. And it's most and foremost about people and about our life. And if you look at the people who are most affected, it's obvious that these are not the people who are causing the problem. You see, 80% of the emissions that cause climate change come out of the G20 countries. So 20 countries actually responsible for 80% of the emissions. Or at the time when we did that, all of the African continent, amounting altogether to about 4% of the global emissions, and yet being hardest hit by climate change. This is just simply unjust. And so for me, climate change is not only about getting emissions down radically, immediately, because everything else is just collective suicide. But it's also to supporting those people who haven't caused the problem, who are already living at the edge, who are in poverty or at the brink of getting in poverty, to support them deal with the new challenges that climate change is facing. And that last sentence for me, and you mentioned that I worked with the Food and Agriculture Organization before, is particularly smallholder farmers, because the absurdity of poverty is that so much of our food is actually produced by smallholder farmers. But most of the 800+ million people who go hungry to bed every day are actually smallholders, are food producers. And for me, in creating climate justice, the biggest step we have to do is really supporting smallholder farmers and make them stewards of the climate, stewards of our environment.
Wonderful. So maybe, because I think many of the people watching here are people who are also into local food production and are actively engaged or, actively partnering with their neighbors who are engaged in local food production. So maybe again, from that time with the FAO, How does agriculture need to shift at this time?
Well, there is a whole system out there, a whole food system. And I think understanding the challenge and understanding the opportunity starts by understanding that food production is a system. And it's a system end to end. It's from the farmer to the consumer. It's addressing post-harvest losses. It's addressing cold chains. It's addressing transport issues, urban farming, all of that. If we look at smallholder farmers, I think one of the wrongs we have to fix is that farmers are paid only for their outputs. And the old way of doing things is basically an input-intense, high-output farming where you try to squeeze as much as possible out of a piece of land, where you go into a high degree of mechanization so you can harvest large monocultures. And we know the challenges of that. And climate only being one, biodiversity, soil degradation, water pollution, all of that is being affected by the wrong type of agriculture. So if we are addressing smallholder farmers, I think first of all, we have to adapt to climate change and we have to build resilience to climate change. And that is often by more diverse systems. I'm a big believer in agroforestry, for example, in a diverse set of different crops which help not only the resilience of farmers, because if one type of crop fails you, others might kick in, but it's also essential for biodiversity, and biodiversity in return is essential for actually your resilience against pests and illnesses and so on. So that type of agriculture, and I always say I'm a father of 3 children, if you look at the picture book farm, which rarely exists today anymore, this is actually a pretty climate resilient farm because it has a diverse system that interplays where the waste of one element of that farm is actually the input to another one. So these type of farms have largely disappeared, particularly in developed countries, because of mechanizations, because of an increasing pressure on prices, because they are labor intensive. But labor intensive farms are actually a good thing because we get so many people unemployed. We need so many people in employment. And we need food more than anything else as human beings. So I see that in different systems, we can actually build climate resilience at farmers. But key for that, again, is to understand that farmers are an integral part of our natural life support system. And a part of what we're honoring farmers, and honoring means also paying farmers for, need to be the recognition that they are stewards of the land, that they keep the system intact, and indicators such as soil organic carbon should be playing a key role in honoring farmers, in funneling payments to farmers for actually keeping a stable climate system.
So overall, I think many of us are not feeling so hopeful about the actual implementation of climate action. Where would you say we are currently in terms of the implementation of the Paris Agreement? How are we doing?
Of course, not good enough. Of course. I mean, it is obvious if you look at the emission data, if you look at the impacts of climate change, we are not doing good enough. And it's, as Secretary General Guterres said, it's a race that we are currently losing, but we can absolutely win it. I mean, to understand the Paris Agreement, it is essential to understand that at the heart of it, it's a bottom-up agreement. It's a pledge and review system in which countries pledge what they want to do to counter climate change. And the Paris Agreement is taking that together and putting it in a perspective, saying we need to stay well below 2 degrees, ideally 1.5 degrees, as we know from the IPCC report. How this is being done is nationally determined. So the basis of it is nationally determined contributions. So my big plea to everybody seeing that is get involved in the formulation of your national NDCs. And if your voice is not being heard, speak up, speak louder, be pushy in getting your agenda through, because we can only achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement if we are really able to mobilize people at the grassroots to take ownership for their climate plans. And it's indeed exactly at the grassroots where possible climate action is. I mean, your movement, people who are working on organic agriculture, who are rethinking the food chains, who are restoring pieces of land that were lost for agriculture. These are climate activists. These are the avant-garde of people who are doing useful work to really keep the climate systems under control. Or think about companies. It's often the small startups that are turning to renewable energy, that are replacing kerosene lamps by solar lanterns, that are investing in decentralized renewable energy. But these people need help, they need support, they need to be listened to. They need to get out of the corner of, well, this is some boutique fringe solution, to the understanding of, no, this is the new mainstream. And in many governments, there is still a deeply ingrained belief that fossil fuels are the cheap, reliable, safe energy, which is not true anymore. Not only for climate, but oil and gas and coal exploitation becomes more and more dangerous, more unstable. The prices for fossils are fluctuating. So we need a global change of the narrative in which people do understand that investing in a renewable energy system is just making economic sense. It also makes sense in terms of climate resilience. It makes sense in terms of empowering people, bringing energy to rural areas that have never seen modern forms of energy, as in electricity, before. So for me, the Paris Agreement is all there. It is sort of the polar star telling us where we have to go. But to make it happen, we need the countries. And to make it happen in the countries, we need the population. I mean, in terms of crisis, and this is a crisis, you go back to the sovereign. And in a democracy, the sovereign is the people.
You go back to the
sovereign, to the people who are the sovereign, who are basically owning their country.
Wow, I like that. It often doesn't feel that way, right?
Well, it is in the end the people, and the politicians who speak on your behalf sometimes need to be reminded that they actually speak on your behalf. And if they don't, well, you have to go to the streets and be loud.
Yeah. Yeah, some are using, language of around war to describe the situation we are currently in with the fossil fuel giants, but also other companies that are still seem intent on maximizing profits at a time when it seems like it's either maximizing profits or protection of life for future generations. So are we in this deadlock? Do we need to work with those kind of images in our movements?
Well, I mean, not least because I'm a German, I'm very careful with images of war. That is never a good solution. Because also, I mean, we are talking to people in the fossil fuel industry, and they don't have two horns and smell of sulfur. These are normal people. They have their families, they have their daughters, they have their sons, and their kids are asking the right questions as well. And in turning towards a new normal, a new climate safe normal, we have to work with everybody. We are not at war with people. We are not antagonizing people. But where maybe the war image might be appropriate is if you think, for example, about how the United States entered the Second World War and how an entire economy shifted within weeks into a giant logistics machinery to actually win the war against the Nazis. That shows you what is possible in terms of turning an entire economic system around. And maybe that is something that I would accept in this analogy. And the second analogy is, if you dislike your neighbor, but then your neighbor and you are attacked by the same person, then suddenly it unites you because you got a common enemy. Well, our common enemy is the climate crisis, and we have to fix that. And I hope that, in terms of us as a species, that this external pressure that our own life support systems is sending us strong warning signs and saying, well, you know, it cannot continue like that, actually helps us to better cooperate and to really find ways of, you know, what Christiana always called radical cooperation, which maybe is a very good way to term it. And let me say one last sentence, which I found really interesting. I have been speaking to a central banker recently who said, as a central banker, if I ignore the fact of climate change, if I just put it aside for a moment, there is so much liquidity in the markets, there's so much money in the markets that we are risking that a big bubble explodes and we are in the next financial crisis. And the only way to avoid that is that all this virtual money is actually being anchored in real value. So even on the money side, we don't only have the imperative from climate change, we have a massive opportunity to really invest into a renewable and a climate safe future now, because money is dirt cheap. If you buy a house, you can get a mortgage for less than 1%. In some places, even negative interest. It doesn't get any cheaper to invest into what needs to be done anyway than now.
Yeah, so maybe, you know, as you've spoken before about the small scale solutions that are actually implementing the change we need to see on the ground, you know, which is a lot of the permaculture movement, agroforestry movement, the Ecovillage movement, transition town, etc. But we see again and again that even with these big green climate funds, it seems very hard to bring those funds all the way down to civil society initiatives. And in our African partner countries, we see again and again that a lot of the climate funds get stuck in the different levels of decision making that they have to run through, so that finally on the ground there's nothing to very little that arrives. What can we do to bring this possibility of financial liquidity to where it's needed most?
Yeah. Let me start by telling you, inside the Green Climate Fund, and I've been attending board meetings, the problem is seen and it is being addressed currently. There is, for example, new lines for readiness. Readiness meaning for the preparation of large-scale projects. It was understood that particularly least developed countries do need support to write the project proposals that are needed. On the other hand, you know, donor countries who pump money into the Green Climate Fund, they need to justify their expenses to their budget committees in parliament. So they need to meet very rigorous standards in where do you allocate double-digit millions. So to bridge that gap between the capacity to really formulate such a project and have it on the other side watertight so you can really justify the money is being spent, there's a capacity gap, obviously, which can be addressed by some of the readiness money, but it's also a question of scale. I don't know how big your projects are, but I would reckon that, you know, to work in a village, you don't need millions. You need maybe $10,000s of dollars, even less maybe. And that is not the scale of a Green Climate Fund project. That would be somewhere between $20 and $100 million. So what we need also on the national basis or on regional basis is to pool similar projects and say, here are 20 eco-villages presenting a plan together, and here is a financial intermediary like a small-scale rural bank that is actually able to chop down $20 million into tranches of 20 or 30 or 50,000. And that is often where the bottleneck is, to have a financial entity that can absorb a larger sum and break it down in a reliable way into the smaller chunks needed. This has been, I think, in developing countries for a long time a bottleneck, and there is some sort of disruptive technology where I have high hopes on, like blockchain, where you could shortcut these things and really establish a direct relationship.
Great.
And, you know, I mean, if I may add a sentence to that, you know, the Secretariat is also organizing regional climate weeks, which are not negotiation, but sharing of best practices, exchanging work, and so on. And I have seen quite a few fantastic initiatives where people look into direct marketing. So, for example, there are good initiatives supporting beekeepers or training people how to become beekeepers. And good honey is something that you can sell everywhere in the world. And I remember one example where really exceptionally good honey was sold directly to Michelin star restaurants in Europe for a premium. And so you bridge all the middlemen and you go directly in selling it for a premium price for the quality that actually is justified and the production method. And, you know, with the internet and, you know, the digital age, there are possibilities just to go directly and bridge between producers who produce in an ethical and climate friendly way and consumers who actually estimate the quality and the story and the background and want to procure goods that are not only good for themselves, but also for the planet.
Wonderful. And, you know, just as a short feedback, we actually signed MOUs, agreements with 8 African governments at COP25 to bring national Ecovillage development programs to the whole country. So this is like starting with 10 communities, but then scaling up to hundreds. And so we're currently looking at funding for 8 countries for these programs. So I think it'd be very interesting to see how we can, work on.
I mean, can I give you a bit of a crazy idea, maybe?
Yes, please do.
Well, you see, when I was a kid, my parents would save for my education, and there were government certificates that would yield 4 or 5%, maybe run for 5, 6 years, but they were secure enough. So my parents would put in money for the education of their kid. I would love to do the same thing for my daughters, right? But there is no bank that's giving you 4 or 5% and a degree of security. If investments of the eco-villages, and particularly land restoration, is actually quite a no-brainer. You take a piece of land that's worthless and you return it into something that yields food and vegetables and all sorts of produce. If you could somehow turn that into an offering for ordinary people who would, you know, have to say $500 or $1,000 at a moderate and reasonable interest rate, like 3, 4, 5%, I think you could reach a lot of people in developed countries who would have a double win because they would have savings, as I said, for their children or for old age or whatever it might be, while at the same time investing in something they can believe in.
Well, I would need help and advice. I love the idea. I mean, the countries that are signing up are some of the poorest countries in the world and many of the countries that are coming out of civil war situations. So I've always been so nervous to offer security for these kind of investments. You know, how do we do that? But I want to follow up on this conversation.
Well, you know, I mean, most interesting area, particularly working with very troubled countries, as you mentioned, is actually working with the diaspora. How many of the citizens of these countries are working somewhere in Europe or the United States and are sending money home? And they do it anyway. And they would be prepared to invest in their local currency and to invest in their countries. If you look at the financial streams of transfer payments by the diaspora, it's enormous. And I think there's a lot of potential to funnel a bit of that money into investments for these countries into the future.
Wonderful. Yeah, and you were just already speaking about the climate weeks in the regions, and I know the African Climate Week is coming up. So I would love, you know, because we have listeners here from all the regions in the world, are you able to say a few words about the particular situation that each of the world's big regions faces in their transition processes?
Well, we have seen over the last years that the regional climate weeks are becoming from an expert meeting on CDM projects to really an all-encompassing platform where we speak about all aspects of climate change: capacity building, adaptation, resilience, mitigation options, all of the above. And the good thing about the regional climate weeks is they are not negotiations. So people are free, it's much less political, they are free to exchange what is in their minds and what's happening. I've been attending the Regional Climate Week recently in Brazil, in Salvador de Bahia, which was really fascinating because this was exactly at the time when the Amazon rainforest burned, and the impression that left all over the planet was devastating. But I have met 5,000 people there who really are active and are pushing and are working on their solutions and totally understand the central importance of rainforests for the climate and biodiversity system, who are producing solutions, who are really being a good force of that. So for me, the regional climate weeks can be a little bit like the yeast and the dough that is helping to transform societies, and where people who are still often rather isolated and lone callers in the desert actually understand and feel that they are part of a big community, can learn from each other what works and what doesn't work. And so, you know, we are going to Africa, to the Asia Pacific region, to the Caribbean and Latin America. And the problems are not dissimilar. If you look at Africa, if you look at Latin America, it's very, very much about agriculture. No wonder, because, you know, agriculture for me and in reality is one of the biggest pressure points that we have, or maybe the biggest pressure point to really counter the interdependent environmental crisis. I'm reluctant just to speak about climate. It really is also soils and biodiversity and water and what have you. So agricultural systems, a big priority, of course, for Africa and for Latin America. Think about soy exports, but also, I mean, in Asia, palm oil production, slash and burn agriculture is one of the big topics. And then the other central topic is, of course, renewable energy system, the availability, the affordability of systems, where, you know, it's quite fascinating because in energy, you got really a leapfrog situation. It's not like in Europe or the United States where you have an existing energy system that needs to be replaced by another one. You basically have no energy system. And the source of energy is burning wood or straw or dung or what have you. And if you replace that by modern systems like solar cookers, or even only more fuel efficient cookers and solar lighting, you actually jump into the next level of development. And, you know, personally, and said it at the outset, I'm German, I think what my country has done for development cooperation is little compared to what the German energy turnaround has done for the prices of solar panels. They have plummeted by a factor of 25 or so, and has made renewable energy suddenly affordable and the energy of choice for large parts of the world.
Yeah, fantastic. It's one point that I also would like to bring up is about human rights and climate refugees. And only a few days ago, on the 21st of January, I believe, the Human Rights Committee ruled on a complaint by, I think it's Ioane Taitiota. I can't say the name, but from Kiribati in the Pacific. Yeah. The first person who really complained and got this complaint agreed with by the Human Rights Committee, that individuals seeking asylum from the effects of climate change have the right to seek asylum. And if they are facing climate change induced conditions that violate the right to life, they have a right for safety. So, you know, knowing that just in the first half of 2019, extreme weather events already displaced 7 million people across the world. You know, what is the situation of climate refugees and climate asylum that we are facing? How do you see this shifting our reality in the future? And also, you know, being from Germany, where the German society took in a lot of refugees in the past years. Yeah, how do you see this shifting our societies?
Well, I mean, here I cannot speak for the Secretariat because this is not a human rights secretariat, but I may say a little bit out of my past because in 2007, I was the EU lead negotiator in building the Human Rights Council, which is the successor to the Human Rights Committee. And it's the Human Rights Council that did this ruling in January. And, you know, I mean, makes me a little proud of my baby, if I can say. But, you know, the Human Rights Council is doing some groundbreaking work here. And of course, this is not translating directly into national legislation, but it's setting the tone. And I mentioned at the outset the resolution that the Maldives brought in 2007 on human rights and climate change. It's setting the tone, and that is creating a debate. And I think this is something the United Nations instruments are very good at, to set a tone, to trigger a discussion. And we have to think about the situation of people who are displaced by climate change. The term refugee is a political term. And, you know, if you speak to colleagues at the High Commissioner of Human Rights, they will tell you that the refugee status is defined in the Geneva Conventions. And there's also some concern that if you expand that term too far, you're basically losing protection of people who are prosecuted for political reasons. So it's a delicate discussion there. But I think what's very clear is if climate change goes unabated, you will have so many people displaced that even the most liberal refugee policy cannot fix the problem. But this term of international mobility might help countries to better understand how big the problem is. You know, I mean, there are 7.5 billion people on this planet, and they're living on specific pieces of land. And if they are losing their land or if they're losing their livelihoods, they might be pushed in a situation of distress where the last possibility is just to go someplace else. So there is a massive interest also from this perspective to really support the adaptation efforts of these communities and helping them building resilience, and more than anything else, to stop pumping more CO2 in the atmosphere as fast as possible. I mean, I have said at the outset the central importance of adaptation, but even the best adaptation in the world will not be sufficient if we continue to raise our emissions instead of going sharply down, where we know now by the last UNEP gap report that we need to go down by 7.5% per year. And taking the last updates from science, it might even be a higher number than that. So no matter how high this number is, it basically screams at us and saying, stop right now. And that is what we have to do.
Yeah. Yeah, so stop right now. And the people on the ground watching this are ready to stand up to do our part. So, you know, what are some of the steps that you would like to see us take in communities around the planet to stop concretely? You know, how do people on the ground most effectively influence their NDCs? And also maybe in relationship to that, the UNFCCC has been setting up the platform for Indigenous people and local communities. What prompted that, and how can the voices of local sustainable communities be brought more strongly to COP26?
Well, a couple of questions. I mean, situation is different for every single citizen of this planet. So it's very hard to be general. But one thing that I really can say for every single citizen of this planet is make your voice heard, become a part in formulating your national NDCs. Unless they are being owned by all of society, unless they are being implemented by all of government, they will not be meaningful. And giving the most vulnerable a voice is a key instrument in doing that. Second thing, you mentioned the indigenous and local communities work of UNFCCC. I think this is something we can all be very, very proud of, because, under classic international public law, there would not be a role for a subset of people from one country to have their own representation. But the situation of indigenous peoples is so unlike anything else. And they have been showing for sometimes thousands of years how you live in harmony with your environment, how you are a part of the natural ecosystem without destroying it, that we have a lot to learn from indigenous communities, and we honor that. I mean, we are meeting them on the highest level. My boss, the executive secretary, has met the indigenous peoples right at the outset of the Madrid conference, and they are becoming, and they are an integral part of our conference. And I think it's a fantastic development. And, it is not done by saying what you have to say once. In politics, if you have something to say, you have to say it again and again and again and hammer this message home. And I can just hope that those who are watching are not getting tired in saying the same thing all over again, because every morning somebody wakes up who hears this message for the first time. And we need a lot of people saying the same thing. And the last thing about, how do people actually take ownership of the climate? How do they change? Well, this is one of the key questions, because it is difficult to make people aware of the problem and avoid that people are falling in desperation about it. But I think one of the really empowering points and one of the really emotional points, and we humans are guided by our emotions, is really food. The way we produce, the way we consume, the way we prepare food is a key part. And if we just get people worldwide, for example, to take their food waste, to take their, potato peels and what have you, and turn that back into soil, which is just a normal part of a closed ecosystem, that would already help tremendously. It's staggering how much harm is being done by organic waste being mixed by other waste and then becoming useless and unable to bring it back. So even if you live in a city, if you have your little composter on your balcony, that is a very concrete step. And if you think better about what you buy and what you actually need, that might be much better for your own body, and that might be better for the environment. So I think the whole food system point is really also a point of personal empowerment. And that slowly gets traction, that people understand what I'm doing here, what is in my fridge, has actually a story behind it, and maybe even the story in front of it.
Wonderful. And it's the one thing when we did our first impact assessment of eco-villages around the world, it was the one point that 100% of food waste is composted in eco-villages around the world. So it's, as you say, it's the one thing we can do now. Yeah.
And if you need one single simple indicator for good agriculture, it's soil organic carbon. It's basically, are you increasing or at least keeping your soil organic carbon? Then it's good agriculture. Are you depleting it? Then you're actually doing mining, and that's not good agriculture.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Martin, for spending this time with us. I think it was super enlightening, really interesting.
Thank you very much.
We will be coming and visiting you at COP26 in Glasgow.
Wonderful. Looking forward to it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.